together, and so it is. Well, thank everyone for being here today, for joining us today. February, of course, in our culture, February is a month of love. Valentine's Day is February 14th, and it's a most interesting time to be an observer of human nature. You know, it doesn't matter how young or how old people are. This innate desire that we have, this desire to love, is within each and every one. And I think that's so important for us to remember. Even the people we don't like, even the people who we would call our enemies, even the people who would do us harm, there's a desire to love within each and every one. And if we can recognize that we the race, we the human race, we as spiritual beings, that we share this desire to experience the oneness, then perhaps that gives us a place to start, a common ground to start, to heal the divides that our culture, our world experiences. I know I've told this story before around the same time of the year, but it was just so perfect. It just I think illustrates what we're talking about so well that I need to share it again. I traveled quite a bit for business, and I spent more time than I care to tell you about in airports. And this one time I was in the airport. It was Atlanta. I remember it was Atlanta because we were sitting there waiting for our plane, and this big commotion started coming down the hall, and there was this bath of light. The corridor just lit up with light that was just slowly moving towards us, and the hustle and the bustle of this crowd, and people kind of murmuring and moving and shuffling their feet and all kinds of things. I wonder, what in the world is that? And what it was former President Jimmy Carter and his wife were coming down the concourse to go board a flight somewhere, and the media was surrounding them, you know, and they had the lights on and the cameras going, and as they walked by, you know, they kind of went by, and this whole commotion kind of passed, and I looked across, as I was looking at this scene going past, I looked across at the gate across the corridor from where my gate was. And people were waiting for the plane to arrive, and this was before 9/11. In those days, you could actually go to the gate to meet someone getting off the plane. And there was this elderly gentleman there. I guess he must have been in his mid-80s or perhaps early 90s. And he was dressed, if you remember Cliff Arquette, when Cliff Arquette, Charlie Weaver was this character Cliff Arquette played on. We probably remember him from the Match Game, but his tie was a little bit too short, and his hat was a little bit frumpled, and the shirt the man had on, you know, was kind of wrinkled. It was mostly clean. It was kind of wrinkled, but obviously it wasn't new. But I got the sense in watching him that these were the best clothes that he had for that day. And he had a little bouquet of flowers, not very many, just 2 or 3 flowers. He might have even picked them himself in his garden. You know, they didn't look like they were from a florist. And he was just standing there waiting, you know. And I knew he was waiting for someone special, someone beloved to get off that plane. And the plane pulled up at the gate, and you know, the way that it works is when the plane gets to the gate and people start coming out, the first people that get out are the business people who have been flying first class, and they're running to make a connection somewhere. So they come out and they typically have, you know, a briefcase and a small carry-on bag, and they're trucking. They're trying to make it across the airport to get a connecting flight. And then after that, you know, other people start coming out. Slowly they start coming out, and people gather around. They kind of crunch around and form a little column for the departing passengers to pass through. And this gentleman was short, and he kind of got pushed to the back of the column, and he couldn't hardly see, you know. And you have to get the picture. Here he is, God bless him, standing there with his little flowers in his hand, with his little hat on his head, and he's just kind of peering through that crowd, and he's trying to see whoever this is that he's waiting for. And of course, as people get off the plane, the folks waiting for him, there's the big hug scene, and there's smiles and the laughter, and then they all start to walk away, and the crowd starts to thin out, And this gentleman was able to get up kind of closer to the front, and he could see a little bit better. But he's kind of looking, and at first when the people get off the plane, there's a steady stream. Like I say, the businessmen lead the charge. They're running in their suits and ties and briefcases, and they're trucking. And then comes this steady stream of people coming off the plane. And then you start to see parents with little children and picking up strollers and all kinds of things like that. And pretty much the trickle of people coming out of the plane slows down. And he's standing there, and he's waiting. And there's nobody coming down the gate. It's as if the entire plane is empty, There's no one there. The flight attendants start coming off, And he's just standing there, looking at that door. And finally she arrived. The love of his life. Sweet little old lady. Also looked like she was in her 80s or early 90s. And in those days when older people traveled, they always dressed to the hilt. I don't know why they got dressed up to get on a plane, but they did. And she was all dressed up, and she had a bag with her, and he went up to her just like a kid would. He just went up to her, and he stood there, and he gave her the flowers, and she smiled, and she bent over, and she kissed him on the cheek, and they hugged, and together they walked down the concourse. I thought, what a beautiful lesson in life. They're in the middle of this hustle and bustle of the Atlanta airport, which I think at the time was the first or second busiest airport in the nation. O'Hare and Atlanta used to go back and forth between 1 and 2. But there was love. There was love. I don't know that they exchanged 2 or 3 words between them, but it was obvious that there was love. You see, there's something there that's ineffable. There's something there that even if I try to describe it, I can't paint the picture with words that is good enough to really convey what I felt, just as an observer, what I felt. Excuse me, I need a drink here. What I felt watching this expression of love. And I think what happens to us as human beings, I think what happens to us when we experience something like that, it takes us back in our own memory, in our own life, and it brings us back to a time when we experienced this complete love, this complete unconditional love, whenever that may have been the day before, it may have been years before when we were kids and with our grandparents, whenever. But it is an experience that we as human beings share. In that experience, there is the oneness, there is the I amness, there is the sameness. And this is the kind of love that we're talking about today. Now, I don't know if everybody gets the emails or reads the emails, but in last night's email, I mentioned one of my favorite movies is the 1946 version of The Razor's Edge. Excuse me, it was a novel by Somerset Maugham. Pretty much, I think, came from his experience in the First World War. But the 1946 version of the film featured Tyrone Power and Gene Tierney, and this was kind of the golden age of cinema. This was black and white cinema, and movie stars were gorgeous people and glamorous, and when Tyrone Power or Gene Tierney entered the scene, the camera would just linger on them, and their eyes would dart around like they were looking for somebody in the room. So the eyes picked up the lighting, in the scene and just kind of danced, you know. Filmmaking was very much an art and very much visual storytelling. Today it's a lot of action sequences and special effects and things like that. But the story, as it's told, and the reason I mentioned the 46 version is you might be more familiar with the newer version with Bill Murray, which was also a good film, but in my opinion, you know, the way that I like films, I prefer the 46 version better. And the 46 version goes a little bit more into the spiritual quest of the character. So the main character of the novel is a fellow named Larry Darrell, and he was an ambulance driver during the First World War. And there he was exposed to the horrors of war, the man's inhumanity to man, what human beings are capable of doing in destroying one another. And it shook him, see, it kind of shook him to the core. And he went on a quest. He went on a quest to find the meaning of life. Now this is typical if you read Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey, if you look at Aristotle's Poetics for screenwriters, if you look at the mythology and the way that stories are told, right? The protagonist undergoes some kind of an event that causes this quest, causes this, call it a cognitive dissonance. Excuse me, something just does not make sense to them. And they go seeking the answer. And this is what sets Larry Darrell off on his way. So he travels about, you know, knocking about from job to job, just trying to find his way. And he winds up in a coal mine in England. And there he meets the wizard in the hero's journey. There's always this one character, this wise old character, who gives the hero some clues and some tips along the way, you know, and the hero kind of picks up on those and then follows them, you know. So it's almost like the unraveling of a mystery, you know, where in a mystery the detective goes from place to place and picks up clues. Larry Darrell is looking for the meaning of life. And he goes looking for clues. So he meets this defrocked priest working in a coal mine, and this man is older now, and he's married and he has children, and I don't think they ever explain why he was kicked out of the church, but he was, and he befriends Larry Darrell, and Larry Darrell goes over to his house one night for dinner. Pardon me, my throat is very dry. I have to get a drink. And they get to talking about the Upanishads, and Larry Darrell has no idea what they are. He says, "What are they?" You know. And the wise old wizard, he says, "Son," he says, "if you don't know what the Upanishads are, you don't know nothing." So he lends Larry Darrell his copy of the Upanishads and makes him promise to wash his hands before he touches them. He touches the book, because they work in the coal mines. And Larry Darrell reads the Upanishads and decides he has to go to India to study with the gurus in India, because he's really found something that's speaking to his soul. And he goes to India and he meets this wise old guru who's patiently instructing him and helping him to progress. And there's a scene where Larry Darrell is kind of surrounded by books, all these different books that he's reading, you know, all this different wisdom. It reminds me, Dr. Holmes says when he found the works of Emerson, it was like drinking cool water on a hot summer's day. He just couldn't get enough of it, you know. So Larry Darrell is surrounded by these books. And the guru says to him, he says, there are 3 major paths to enlightenment. There is the yoga of service, there is the yoga of love, and there is the yoga of knowledge. You have chosen the yoga of knowledge. He says, now you can follow any of those paths and they will all take you to the top of the mountain, to enlightenment. And when you get there, you'll find that there really was only one path that looked like three. So this is kind of the setup for the next segment of the movie. And I just love that scene, you know, because the character, the actor who played the guru, you know, he looked like the personification of wisdom. And it's so simple, it's so beautiful, right? There's three major paths, and we can choose which one to take. And if we stay with it, if we stay with the path, we will get to the top of the mountain. We will get to enlightenment. And then we will find that which path we took didn't matter. They all wound up at the top, you see. So there's no sense you and I arguing about, well, this path's better than that path, or it doesn't matter. Each one of us has to find our path. Now, normally during the year when we are working from the Science of Mind textbook and we were talking about spiritual mind treatment and we were talking about the ideas like we've been talking about since the beginning of the year, you know, what is God and what does God do? How does God work? What is my relationship with God? All of these different things, these are intellectual concepts. These are the yoga of knowledge. We are trying to take our intellect and we are trying to help it to point us to a truth that actually lies beyond the intellect or before the intellect. The Upanishads say that which is before thought, but from which thought comes. That's the razor's edge. Excuse me. We're walking the razor's edge. We are using the intellect to take us to a place where the intellect doesn't exist, where the intellect cannot function, where logic and reason don't work. Remember last week I talked about the singularity of the physicists, a place where the laws of physics don't work, but the laws of physics can tell them that there's a place where the laws of physics don't work. But once we get there, we don't know what to do in terms of trying to describe it in the laws of physics. So today we are talking about the yoga of love. Normally during the year we talk mostly about the yoga of knowledge. But today we are talking about the yoga of love. Now in his works, Osho talks a little bit about this. He says, you know, there's kind of two major orientations the way we look at life. There is the intellect, which is science, and then there is feeling nature, which is poetry usually. See, because poetry can kind of evoke a feeling from within us that kind of goes beyond the actual meaning of the words, you know. So, you know, it's the synergy of the thing, if you want to call it that. You can read these words and they say what they say, but the inferred meaning that we take from them, it takes us to a totally different place. And this is why I love Rumi so much. Excuse me. Rumi was a Sufi mystic, lived around the year 1300 in Afghanistan. And he writes in poetry of the experience of love. He talks of the moth being drawn to the flame, and how the moth will continue to fly into the glass over the candle until one day it finds the opening when the glass is left off the candle, and the moth can fly into the flame. And even though its body is totally consumed by the fire, that moment of bliss, that moment of ecstasy, that moment of being completely united with the flame is what has been driving the moth all along. Now, scientifically, we looked at it and said, well, that's not true. You know, it's the light, and the moth navigates by light, and the moth gets confused, and it tries to fly to the light, and as a consequence of flying into the flame, it gets burned up. That would be the intellect's way of looking at it. But I think there is something within our heart. There is something within the very makeup of our psyche that gets what Rumi is trying to tell us. There is that within us that seeks that unification, that seeks that experience of oneness with the divine. And that experience of oneness is love. So I think in order to kind of round out our growth, we need to explore both paths. We need to look at things from logic and reason. We need to ask the deeper questions of life. Who am I? Why am I here? Where am I going? And then there are times that we just need to be in the experience of love. Nothing else. Nothing else. Just be in the experience of love, because that experience itself changes us. That experience itself opens up within us something. Channels, if you want to call them channels. Something within us changes. Something touches our heart. So this is the kind of love that I'm talking about today. This is the yoga of love that I'm talking about today. It is not necessarily the human definition of love, not necessarily the human experience of love. See, love is a word that, like God, it is a word that means virtually anything to anybody. But people nod their heads and they go, ah, yes. God, ah yes, love. But we don't necessarily mean the same thing by that. We don't necessarily have the same understanding of what that is. And the love that we're talking about today, in Christianity it might be called agape love, unconditional love, total love. Love without rhyme, love without reason, love without purpose, you know, love without an object of love, just love, you see. And in the human experience, we as human beings tend to take things and bend them to our purpose. Excuse me, my nose is running. It's kind of making it hard here. It's hard to talk about the ineffable today. So we tend to take things, we try to bend them to a purpose. And here's an example of that. If we go back to the Old Testament, you know, people are taught not to kill. Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's property or thy neighbor's wife, and these kind of things. These are commandments. And they only seem to apply at home. If people go on the road, if they meet another group of people who are considered to be God's enemies, well, then it's okay to kill and to steal and to do all these other things to them. So we kind of take these things and we justify, and we bend their purpose. You know, we say, well, thou shalt not kill, but that doesn't apply to those people over there because well, they're God's enemies. And it's just amazing that God's enemies are always the people that whoever's saying it doesn't like, you know. So we tend to take things and we bend them to our purpose. We bend them to our will. And love has been like that. This idea of love in our society has kind of been twisted and bent and quantified and changed. And yet when we talk about love from the spiritual experience, we are talking about unconditional love. Just love. And remember, we're told in the scripture that God is love. And we're told in the scripture that if you don't know love, you don't know God. So this yoga of love that we're talking about is for many people the surest path to the divine. It is something that can actually be easier to stay with than some of the other practices that we try to do, you know. Can you imagine getting up in the morning and saying, oh my goodness, I have to go love today. Whew, when is this ever going to end, you know? We do that with work, but we would never think to do that with love. See, love is something that we willingly and joyfully participate in. It just does something to us to the point that we would just spontaneously want to do it. You may remember I told you in the story of Moses, right? Moses felt the calling to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. What was going on with the Egyptians and the Israelites, you know, he wanted to fix that. Now, of course, you have to understand that these are metaphors. These are teaching stories. So he felt this calling. He felt this calling to do more, to be more. But he wasn't mature enough yet to do it because he lost his temper and he killed the Egyptian officer and he buried the body in the sand, you know. And I think we all try to do that. We try to bury our mistakes somewhere, pretend they never happened. But he had to go into the desert. Now, that's symbolic of prayer life. He had to go into the desert. And there at a well, now the well usually symbolizes our deeper connection to the divine, our deeper connection to consciousness. And there at the well there were 7 daughters, and they were daughters of a priest. This represents 7 different paths or 7 different aspects to God. But one came forward, and they were married, see? And to me, that represents he took the path of love. See, it was easier. It was appealing to him. He took the path of love to God, and he studied under this priest in the desert for 40 years before he was ready to go back and do his work. So I always tell people there's one path that's going to be very easy for us. Excuse me. And we need to know what that path is because that's the one we'll stay with. That's the one we'll go back to, you know. And then there's one that's going to be very hard for us, and that's the one that offers us the most growth. So we need to understand what the different paths are. We need to understand what is our easiest approach to God. What is the one I'm going to stay with? You know, what is the one that you don't have to make me do it because I'm going to do it anyway. You know, for some of us, myself included, it's difficult. We get up and say, well, I need to meditate. You know, well, I don't feel like doing that right now. I'm going to have a cup of coffee instead, or those kind of things. So that may, for me, offer me my greatest opportunity for growth. But it's difficult for me to do it. But love, you see, love is easy. Love for me is easy. You know, pull up the pictures on the internet of the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren, and oh my gosh, I love when the cousins and everybody post pictures of their babies, you know, and these are my cousins. I've never seen the children. I just know them only by their photographs. But the beautiful smiling faces, you know. I see people post pictures of their pets, of their dogs playing with their animals, and it's just pure love. You see, the animal, what does the animal represent to us? What does the pet dog represent to us but unconditional love, you know? You come through the door at night, the dog doesn't care if you had a good day or a bad day. It just wants to play. It just wants to be petted. It just wants to be loved. This unconditional love is easy. For many, it is easy. But we have to consider that we're not talking the normal human definitions of love. So love has been co-opted. We think of love can only exist in terms of transactions, a transactional love. Now the epitome of that is what we're seeing. We're watching a lot of the period dramas from England, are on Netflix now, and in those families, love was a business deal. See, we're going to marry our son off to your daughter, and our countries will have peace, and we'll keep the money in the family, and we'll each get wealthier. And it's not the kind of head over heels in love kind of thing that we think about. I love Osho. He says, love doesn't even require the same language. He said he knew two people who worked in science together, and they were from two different countries, and they spoke two different languages, and they could communicate around the scientific terms well enough to work together. They understood the science, but they didn't understand much else, and they fell in love. They fell in love, You don't even need to be able to talk to one another. They fell in love. And when people are in love, they sometimes revert to baby talk, talking nonsense talk to one another, pet names for one another, silly little things that people do together when they're in love, because love defies words. Hey, love goes beyond words. But in the human experience, we try to make it a transaction, Well, I will exchange love for security, or I'll exchange love for somebody to take care of me, or I'll exchange love so I can have heirs to my fortune, and all these kind of things that we think of. And we have to get that out of our mind. That's not the kind of love I'm talking about. See, love of God is not a transaction. It's not a transaction. We can't say, okay, God, well, I will love you if you give me this, or I will love you if you give me that. We have these ideas that come to us that said God is a jealous God. You see, God is a jealous God. You must love only God and no other gods, because God is a jealous God. And Rocco Errico gives us a beautiful explanation of that. He said, God can't be jealous. What does God have to be jealous of? God is all that there is. Omniscience, omnipotence, omnipresence. Not some kind of a paranoid person who thinks, oh my goodness, this little person down on earth loves somebody more than me. I am so jealous. Not at all. Not at all. So there's a different meaning to that. And what Rocco Errico tells us is that if you've ever been in a relationship with a jealous person, if you don't give them your full attention, you'll lose them. See? And what the implication of the teaching story is that we must give our full attention to God. We must love beyond any limitations this divine. You see, or we lose it, not because it leaves us and gets angry and goes, but because our mind wanders, we get distracted and we go other places. Excuse me. So love is not a transaction. Love is not a role or a responsibility. Now, it may express itself in roles and responsibilities. It may express itself in seeming transactional ways, in that if you're in a relationship, perhaps you divide the tasks of being in this relationship together so that, one person does this and the other person does that. But love is not the transaction, you see. Love transcends the transaction. We may think that that love can only exist in a relationship. Well, I can only love somebody if I'm in a relationship with them. Or I can only love somebody if my role requires it. Maybe it's a responsibility. Maybe I'm a minister and I'm required. It's my duty to love everybody who comes into my church. See, that's equating love with a role or a responsibility, or love is a relationship. I can only love the people in my family, only people that I share DNA with. Only my cousins, my siblings, my parents, my grandparents, those people it's okay to love because we share something together. But other people, I'm not so sure of, you see. And we need to get beyond all of that. We need to get beyond all of that because love is not a relationship. No, love is not a role. Love is not a responsibility. Yes, it may express itself through all of those things, but it transcends all of those things. All of those things. So what is this thing called love that we're talking about today? And how do we cultivate it, you see? So I'll take us back then to New Testament theology, and it says, God is love. God is love. Well, why would God be love? Well, if love is the experience of unity, and that's my favorite definition these days, love is the experience of unity, the experience of oneness, then God is one. God is all. This is an important concept for us to grasp, but it's even a more important experience for us to have. Out of what does the divine create? It is all that there is. There is, as Dr. Holmes tells us this, there's not God and nothing. Because if there was God and nothing, you'd have to say, where did the nothing come from? If God made everything, out of what did God make everything? Out of itself. Remember what we said, what it does? It creates by becoming the thing created. It expresses itself as the thing created. So if everything and everyone, and this includes our pets, this includes the animals in the forest, this includes the trees and the plants, and the stars of the universe. If all of this is some part of the divine expressing itself in this particular way, right? The entire universe is the body of the divine. You and I are some part of the spirit of the divine that has taken on the persona of you and I. The bodies that we have are the dust of the earth that have been formed to cloak these spirits while we are here. But everything that we are is some part of it. Some part of it. It experiences complete unity and oneness and sameness and I amness and suchness with each and every one of us. It loves us unconditionally. God sends the rain to fall on the just and the unjust alike. It does not withhold from itself. In the parable of the prodigal son, we are told that the son got greedy and wanted the inheritance and took the inheritance and went off and squandered it and wound up living in the pig pen, which was unclean animals, Jewish people. And finally came to his senses and went back home. And he kept telling the father, he says, I'm a terrible son. I left you. I did terrible things. And can you ever forgive me? Just take me back into your house and make me a hired hand. The father never once acknowledged the boy's sins. He said, you are my son. You're back home. Let's celebrate. You see? Unconditional love. So what we want to cultivate then as our spiritual practice is this agape love, this unconditional love, this love that defies roles, that defies relationships, that defies responsibilities, that just love for no reason love, you see. That's another thing we do as human beings. We have to have a reason. Well, they love me, so I'm going to love them back. Well, that's transactional, you see. That's a reason. Love doesn't need a reason. Love is the reason, you see. We are already one. We are already I am together. I amness, suchness, oneness. We must surrender to that. See, that's so very hard for many of us because our head, our ego, our intellect wants to be in control all the time. And love, pure love is not something to be controlled. This is why we talk about falling in love. This is why we talk about people acting foolishly in love, you know. Edward gave up his throne for love. Kings abdicate for love. And it may not even be the agape love that we're talking about, but it's as much love as we can understand. So what is it that you can, or you do, or you will experience complete unconditional love with? See, it may be a memory. It may be a fond memory of a parent or a grandparent or a friend or somebody who may not even be with us any longer, but when you look at their picture, you can go back. You can go back to this period of time where we just felt that unconditional love, you know. I can actually close my eyes and go back in time to a memory of my grandmother rocking me over her shoulder in a rocking chair as a toddler. I don't think I was an infant, but I was a toddler. And she came to visit and I was ready for a nap, and she put me up over her shoulder and she put a blanket over me and she patted me on the back and she sang a little song to me and she rocked me back and forth until I fell asleep. Unconditional love. Unconditional love. For some, it's your pet. It's just being with your pet. For some, it's being with children or grandchildren. For some, it's being with your beloved. What in your life brings you to that experience of unconditional love? Are you willing to surrender to it? Are you willing to indulge in it? Are you willing to sit for a few minutes every day and just bring yourself to this feeling of love? Not wanting anything from it, not expecting anything from it. Just experiencing it. Just experiencing it. When we come to experience love, the kind of love I'm talking about, when we come to experience that, we are experiencing God. And it is the experience of the presence and the activity of God that changes us. Emmett Fox said the only thing that changes consciousness is prayer, but the kind of prayer he was talking about is the prayer, spiritual mind treatment, the prayer that leads us to experience the presence of the divine. The quickest, the surest, the fastest, and for many the easiest way to enlightenment, to the experience of the presence, is by surrendering to love. So if we had Kate Wolf's CD here, we would play Give Yourself to Love. Because truly, truly, that is an approach to God. That is a path to God. That is a means to get beyond the intellect, to walk the razor's edge to the point where the intellect doesn't work, but love does. You see? Love does. I may not be able to express it in words. I am not the poet that Rumi was. But I can know it. I can experience it. I can feel it. Bring your attention up to the area between your armpits. Typically, this is thought of as the center of love. Breathe in and feel the warmth. Bring into your memory a time when you felt unconditional love. And just stay with it. Just stay with it. I invite you for this month of February, for this month of love, just make that your spiritual practice. When you go to the store, can you recognize the people in the store as beautiful expressions of God who want to love and be loved just as much as anybody else? Can we relate to them as human beings and not just cashiers and stock clerks? People with family, people with friends, people with pets, people who have come to learn to love in their own way. Can we celebrate that with each other? Let's get up in the morning and recognize that each and every day is a day to love, a day to grow in love, a day to stay in love, a day to be in love. Whatever works for you, find that love, bring it into your heart, keep it there. Go through the day in love. Be willing to be a fool for love.